Everyone. My name is Dr. Nandi Malumbazo. I'm a senior lecturer at the School of Chemical and Metallurgical Engineering, as well as a sessional lecturer at the Wits Business School. So I would like to take this opportunity to actually welcome you all to the first of its kind, the Just Energy Transition Implications for the Liquid Fuel Sector webinar that is hosted by the Wits Business School. So as we are all aware that the energy sector is the cornerstone of the economic advancement of many global communities, the country's NDP highlights the need for South Africa to have supply and security of energy resources, meaning for both the petroleum sector as well as electricity. South Africa has been heavily reliant on fossil fuels for energy generation, which is a common situation throughout the globe. As we are all aware, this has led to climate change challenges. Therefore, this has led also to a need for a major structural change to supply and demand in our energy systems. In the country, we have observed a majority of these changes, mostly in the electricity sector, of which the petroleum sector is not immune to these challenges. Recently, we have seen the exit of Total Energies on the upstream side of the sector value chain. And in 2023, we have also seen Shell exits on the downstream side. Furthermore, SAPREF has been sold to CEF, which is the country's state-owned entity. And these changes, they actually raise concerns in terms of security of supply of petroleum products. And that is the reason why then the Wits Business School decided to host this webinar so that those who are heavily involved in the sector can come together and deliberate on these challenges and come up with various strategies on how these can be mitigated. What we have on our program today, we have Prof. Maurice, who's actually going to be doing our welcoming note. And we have 4 panel members, and those panel members are Dr. Bongani Saidini, Mr. Craig Mokel, as well as Prof. Rod Crompton. The order of the program for today will actually allow Q&A questions 30 minutes upon the completion of this webinar. And I would like to introduce Prof. Maurice, who is going to actually doing a welcoming note for us. Prof. Maurice is the head of school for the Wits Business School, as well as he's one of the initiators or the founders of the African Energy Leadership Center. And I would like to welcome you, Prof. Maurice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Nandi, for the wonderful work that you're doing in leading this webinar. Let me welcome everyone who's in this webinar. I can see lots of people are here. Some of the names that I see are people that have been in this industry for a very long time, and we've known each other for a very, very long time. So this webinar is about unpacking the role of the liquid fuel sector in relation to the just energy transition. You know, when we were having load shedding, thank God now we don't have it for some time. Now, hopefully it's going to be sustained. But I was wondering that if we can actually have fuel shedding in this country, the impact will be so severe. It will be so bad. And I was concerned that the discussion is only focusing on electricity, and it doesn't focus on what could actually cause this economy to grind to a halt. Some of us who spent over 3 decades in this industry, part of my job, together with Rod here and many of the CEOs of oil companies, and I was an MD of Sasol Oil in my previous life. The only single important role that we played was to make sure that the security of supply was always in place. And we used the word, keep the country wet. 2010, when there was a World Cup here, there was such a serious concern that we may have a crisis of supply. And I was then the chairman of SAPIA, and the whole government was concerned. I remember I was summoned several times to minister at that time of energy to really confirm whether we are going to be able to host this big event of 2010. Over 100 aeroplanes will be landing at OR Tambo Airport. Will we have the jet fuel? And as you remember, those who were there, the games were played throughout the whole of this country. So buses were going up and down. And there was a great concern that we may run out of fuel. And as a SAPIA chairperson, this whole responsibility was on my shoulder. And I remember going to I realized if we do not go and get exemption, competition exemption. At that time, the competition authorities were very, very tough on us as an oil industry. We will not be able to manage that. And I went to the competitions authority and I asked for exemption just for that period of about 6 months to prepare and to make sure that we run the World Cup. And I've never seen the government moving so fast about competition exemption, and we did get it, and we were able to meet almost every second day MDs and CEOs of oil companies, monitoring stock levels at different parts of the country, monitoring stock levels at the airport, and then working together with the logistics, rail, road, to make sure that we keep the country worked. And we successfully did that. And so the reason I'm telling this story is that if anything was a hiccup, we would have been in deep trouble. And there were times where we were close. We were close. I remember quite a number of my holidays, even after 2010, when I was on holiday during December time, particularly during December time, we will have some kind of crisis, and my holiday will be disturbed, and I'll have to come back from my holiday, and in order to be able to work closely with other leaders of the oil companies to keep the country working. The reason I'm telling you this story is that it's very dangerous for us to only focus on electricity as a nation and not really go into the implications of the liquid fuel sector. Because if we don't and understand exactly what are the implications of this transition, and we take decisions which can negatively impact the supply chain of the liquid fuels industry, we're going to be in deep, deep trouble as a nation. So I just want to make that point that before I really took the helm of WBS, where I am now as a lead of WBS, Vets Business School, I spent 30 years in the energy industry, many of those in the liquid fuels industry. Started my career at Shell, and then we embarked on an entrepreneurial journey where I led, together with a team of very good industry leaders, we started Excel Petroleum, and then we sold Excel Petroleum to Sasol Oil, and I became the managing director of Sasol Oil. And I was on the board of Sasol Oil for 14 years, 10 of which I was the chairman of Sasol Oil. And I also served on the board of NATREF. The reason I'm telling you, and I already told you I was a chairman of SAPIA twice actually in my life in the industry. The reason I'm telling you this is not because I'm just telling you about my history and my background, but I want to tell you that liquid fuels runs in my veins. And therefore, it's very important that I supported this initiative that Wits Business School should really spend a lot of time and energy and effort and research to come up with solutions to really make sure that we do not have a misstep on this. Not only did we do that, we worked very hard to establish the Center for Entrepreneurs, the Africa Energy Leadership Center, and Rod was the first and the founding director of that Africa Energy Leadership Center, which is really contributing a lot now in our debate and he's got the 2 programs, a diploma in energy leadership and also a master's in energy leadership. So the reason we started it is because we realized that we need to develop leaders that will understand the complex nature of the value chains of the energy industry, particularly the oil value chain, upstream, midstream, and finally downstream, the value of gas, the value chain of gas, the value chain of the renewable, and all the value chains, and then understand the complexities around that, and also understand the geopolitics that influence this industry, and understand the regulatory framework that influence this industry, and understand the optimal energy mix, so that as we embark on this journey of transition, we understand what is the optimal energy mix. What is really the just energy transition? What are the technologies? What is the governance? What is the regulatory framework that needs to be in place to ensure that we do not cause chaos in our country? So really, it is my pleasure today to partner with the Upstream Training Trust and the Petroleum Agency South Africa to bring you this seminar and this webinar. I would like to thank Dr. Stephen Mateza, our senior lecturer here at AELC, for arranging the webinar. And my thanks to Dr. Nandi Malumbazo, sessional lecturer at WBS, sessional lecturer at WBS, and also at the Vet School of Chemical Engineering, for moderating this discussion. I want to thank you all for the passion you have shown for this topic. I will now hand over to Dr. Nandi, who will introduce in detail the panelists. I would like to personally thank you, the panelists, for taking the time. Dr. Bongani Saidine, thank you very much. Dr. Craig Morkel, thank you very much. And my friend, Dr. Rod Crompton, thank you very much. We've traveled this journey for over 3 decades, you and I. And I really appreciate you stepping in when Dr. Bonani Saidine, due to unforeseen circumstances, could not come in. But you always ever ready to come and assist us. And this is your also industry. You spend all your life in this industry. Thank you very much. I'm sure we're going to have a good session. So let me hand it over back to Dr. Nandi. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Radebe. It is very interesting to see that what was keeping you awake in 2010, it's still what keeping the industry awake even today. And I think there is also a need for the WBS to have continual webinars when it comes to the petroleum sector on how the challenges that are being faced by the sector can actually be resolved. So I'm hoping that this won't be the only webinar that the WBS is actually hosting. Without wasting any further time, let me introduce my panel members. In the panel, I've got Dr. Bongani Saidine, who is a petroleum engineer and has got a PhD in law in oil and gas, with 23 years work of experience in the petroleum sector. He's currently the Chief Operating Officer at PASA, which is the regulator of the upstream oil and gas sector in the country. He has held various technical and strategic roles as a petroleum engineer, reservoir engineer, senior reservoir engineer, principal reservoir engineer, and so on and so forth. Dr. Bongani Saidine holds a bachelor degree in chemical engineering from CPUT, as well as MSc in petroleum engineering from University of London, and a diploma from Imperial College, and a Master's of Law in the Petroleum Law and Policy. And he has a PhD, as I've mentioned, he has a PhD in law. I would like for Dr. Bongani Saidine to actually take the podium, and we're on an online stream. So can you please open up your camera or switch on your camera, Dr. Saidine? Thank you very much. And then our second speaker then, or panel member, is Mr. Craig Mokel, who's the chairperson of the gas economy leadership team of the South African Oil and Gas Alliance, which is abbreviated SAOGA. He's also a chief executive officer of Ikapa Energy, an energy and water projects developer, which is an energy and water projects developer. Craig served as a member of parliament from 1999 to 2009. And during this time, he served on the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee of Minerals and Energy. And our third speaker is Prof. Rod Crompton. Prof. Rod Crompton is a visiting adjunct professor at the African Energy Leadership Center at Wits Business School. Previously, he ran Crompton Consulting, specializing in industrial policy, energy, and economic regulation. He has been a research fellow at the Center of Competition Regulation and Economic Development and Research Associate at the Trade and Industry Policy Strategy, which is abbreviated TIPS, and which is advising the South African Department of Trade and Industry. He also served at various government departments, and one which I can think of, he used to be a DDG for the Department of Energy then. And I would like to thank you, Prof. Rod, for joining us as well. So on my panel members, can you then try to explain what is your understanding about then the just energy transition, but then the context of just energy transition should be then in the petroleum sector? Let me start with Dr. Saidini. You're on mute, Dr. Saidini.
Thanks, Dr. Nandi. Good afternoon, Prof. Maurice Hadebe, Dr. Nandi. Afternoon to my fellow panelists, as well as to all those who are attending this webinar. My name is Bongani Saidini, as already introduced. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the Petroleum Agency SA. Yes, we are asked to talk about the just energy transition and the implications for the liquid petroleum sector. I think I first need to refer to who the Petroleum Agency is. As the Petroleum Agency, we regulate the upstream petroleum sector in this country. We are mandated in terms of Section 70 of the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act to process applications for rights ranging from technical cooperation permits, exploration rights, which have a total 9-year duration, production rights, which have a duration of 30 years. We also monitor compliance, both technical compliance as well as environmental compliance, technical compliance with the what is called the work program that would have accompanied the applications in terms of exploration rights and production rights. We monitor environmental compliance against environmental management programs that would have been submitted as part of the process of applying for rights. I think the upstream petroleum sector, just to give a sense of, it's the beginning of the petroleum value chain. There can be no liquid fuels without the search for oil and gas, which serve as feedstock in the production of liquid fuels. So the liquid fuels come as a result of the processing of crude oil and gas, which would have been discovered through exploration and production efforts that happen in the upstream in terms of the value chain. So that is the space that, as the Petroleum Agency, we regulate. And I think, given my responsibility within the Petroleum Agency, it would be remiss of me not to indicate that, okay, one of our responsibilities as the Petroleum Agency is to assess the prospectivity, the hydrocarbon or petroleum prospectivity of the country. Assess the petroleum prospectivity of the country. And I must say, we also have the responsibility. We also are the custodians of the National Petroleum Database. So I can boast and say we have access to all of the data ever acquired in South Africa, data as it relates to oil and gas exploration and production. All of that data sits with the Petroleum Agency, data that's been acquired going back to even before the formation of SUCO, then the organization charged with exploration and production of oil and gas in the country. That's 1965. And even recent data that's been acquired through seismic acquisitions, through drilling, a part of that data come to the Petroleum Agency SA. So when we make assessments in terms of petroleum prospectivity of the country, we sit in the fortunate position of having access to all of this data. So what do we see as the Petroleum Agency in terms of the potential oil and gas in the country? We estimate that this country has about 27 billion barrels and 60 trillion cubic feet in prospective oil and gas resources. This is offshore South Africa, along the coasts, West Coast, South Coast, and East Coast. We also estimate that onshore shale gas and other onshore areas where gas has been discovered, for example, in the Free State, as well as in the Mpumalanga area, we estimate there's in excess of 200 trillion cubic feet of technically recoverable shale gas resources plus shallow gas and so on. Just to give context in terms of what does this mean? The gas to liquids refinery that is owned by PetroSA and was operated by PetroSA in Mossel Bay, the decision to build that refinery by the then government in its pursuit of its policy of energy self-sufficiency was taken on the back of 1 trillion cubic feet of gas having been discovered off the South Coast. So we estimating this country sits with 60 TCF in prospective resources offshore only. A decision was taken by the then government on the back of 1 TCF. That refinery, which started production in 1992, has actually produced about 1.5 TCF of gas over a 28-year period, starting in 1992 all the way to 2020. So that's the magnitude of what a 1.5 TCF can do for you. And the Petroleum Agency estimates there could be up to 60 TCF offshore only. In terms of, another major decision was taken when the Romco pipeline, the pipeline exporting gas from Mozambique, Pande Temane gas fields to Sasol, Secunda, and onwards, I think all the way to the Free State, Richards Bay, and even Gauteng, part of that gas is supplied there. That decision to build that 865-kilometer pipeline, 26-inch, was taken on the back of 3.5 TCF discovered gas. So 3.5 TCF, you can build a pipeline, 865-kilometer, supply a refinery of about 150,000 barrels per day in terms of its processing capacity. And that refinery, and that gas from the Panellists fields has been running since, I think, 2004. So for the last 20 years, 3.5 TCF has been running, feeding a refinery of 150,000 barrels per day and various other off-takers in that northern corridor. So that's significant. I just want to move a little bit to oil. We are estimating 27 billion barrels in prospective oil resources. Angola has, in terms of in reserves, about 9 billion barrels of oil. They have about 11.5 TCF in terms of gas, but the difference being, or the qualifier being, these are discovered reserves. So meaning these are reserves that are even in production. But let's say 27 versus 9 billion, a third. It's a third of what we think are prospective resources in this country. On the back of that, I think the economy, Angola, or oil and gas contributes some 50% to the GDP of that country. I think 75% to its revenues and 89% in terms of its export earnings. That is the value of the upstream petroleum sector in a country. And this is potential value that's sitting within our own shores. So, okay, there is also the macroeconomic impact, for example, if I were to go there. But I think, for example, just briefly, Dr. Nandi made mention of discoveries and of Total Energies exiting their discoveries in Block 11B, 12B of the South Coast. The macroeconomic impact or estimates in terms of the macroeconomic impact of that discovery, if it was to be processed at the gas to liquids refinery in Mozambique, is, I think, something like 22 billion per annum in terms of contribution to GDP, about 25 billion in government take in the form of tax and royalties, and 26.5 in terms of balance of payments, more import substitution. So as we contend with, or as we grapple with how just the transition, or in terms of jobs for that matter, that the sustained operations at the GTL refinery would mean sustenance of at least 1,000 jobs in terms of direct, but up to 5,000 in terms, if you include indirect and induced, and about 42,500 in terms of employment opportunities. So the just energy transition must not lose sight of that. And this is only the upstream petroleum sector. And I've said, resting on this sector, the liquid fuel sector rests on this sector. Otherwise, there could be no petrol, fuel, petrol, diesel, paraffin, jet fuel, LPG, and all of those. And whereas there would also not be bitumen, for example, meaning you would have serious challenging in the building of roads, the tar that you need, the HFO, which you need for bunker fuel, LPG, and various other products. I think I'll stop here for now, Doc.
Thank you, Dr. Saidini. And we really do appreciate the background information that you have afforded us with, more especially when it comes to the resources of oil and gas in the country, the ones that we are actually embedded with, as well as the macroeconomics contribution of such, or the potential macroeconomic contribution of such. And I will allow Mr. Mokel to actually try and respond to the question of then the just energy transition in the petroleum sector. Over to you, Mr. Mokel.
Thank you, Dr. Nandi. Yeah, colleagues, I just want to correct something that was incorrect in the introduction. I'm not a doctor. I'm Mr. Mokel. I have not gone to the London School of Economics. I just wanted to correct that firstly. Colleagues, this is a thesis, considering that I'm amongst PhD graduates, and my thesis is the following: that there's the context in which we must consider the just energy transition is how it harmonizes our key imperatives, the energy trilemma in particular: energy security, affordability, and environmental sustainability. In a panel discussion similar to this one earlier this year, one of the key officials in the then DMRE, Tabang Odat, confirmed in answer to a question that the sixth administration took a decision that the weight assigned to each of those three key imperatives is energy security first, affordability second, and environmental sustainability third. Now, if that's the policy position, then one would assume that this would inform the master planning of our future energy mix. And let's start there, that the ambition might be to achieve net zero by 2050 and implement our nationally determined commitments as it presently is. And that the debate really is, what are the next transitional steps to get us there? And is it one that should be a technology choice, or one that says, by any means, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Right? It's a different thing to say, support a particular technology, from saying we might have a higher emitting technology and therefore a higher emitting economy, when we can move to lower emitting options in the interim. And we have to accept that the grid has to be built out to accommodate our ambition in terms of variable renewable energy. And we need to accept that the grid might not keep pace with our ambitions, that there are constraints, financial and technical. And that we therefore need to consider very carefully how we plan this transition so that gas and other rapid response technologies could fill the gaps that are there, as well defined in Ronald Murray's PAC thesis, that you have all of these ingredients, 7 essential services, to maintain grid stability, in other words, energy security. That if you compromise them in any way, then we are back to load shedding, where we don't want to go. Just on load shedding, in closing, I think when we look at when load shedding manifested itself around about 2008, we did not realize how long this bubble was building up and waiting to burst. And Rod could correct me here, he was around at the time as well, that it was actually before the release of the Energy White Paper in 1998, where there was already a warning signal issued by Eskom that if we do not add new generation capacity, we will face load shedding, as we then eventually did, almost on time. And so these imperatives in the energy trilemma must then also serve a higher purpose, and that is inclusive growth. In particular, unemployment, poverty, and inequality need to be addressed. And therefore, the planning needs to consider how each energy mix option that the energy modelists come up with, how that would impact the socioeconomic circumstances of our people. Then we're talking about social justice and environmental justice being in harmony through an evidence-based planning process. And our procurement can follow from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mokel, for your contribution, more especially highlighting the fact that the country has made some commitments when it comes to then the energy trilemma, which then needs or must then support inclusive growth when it comes to job employment and so on and so forth. And I would like to then also Prof. Rod Crompton to also share his views on the just energy transition, more especially its implications when it comes to then the petroleum sector or the liquid fuel sector. Over to you, Rod.
Thank you, Nandi. So let's go back to the beginning. Where does this just energy transition idea come from? It comes from global warming. And what's causing global warming? It's human activity on planet Earth. And a lot of that human activity that's contributing to global warming is burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, whatever the case may be. So the concern about global warming is that it's causing a lot of discomfort to human habitation, and ultimately it will lead to the extinction of humans. And for some reason, humans don't want to go extinct. They want to carry on living on the planet. So they've decided globally to do something about it. And there are all sorts of international treaties and conventions and what have you, which have resulted in what's called a nationally determined contribution for South Africa. So all countries have got to do something about this global warming. It's called the nationally determined contribution, and that's our share. So the question then confronting South Africa is, that's our share of the planet's effort to save humanity. How should we do it? And who should do it? And that's where the big discussion comes in, because people are following the NIMBY process. NIMBY is short for not in my backyard. So yes, those people over there, they should do it, but not me. I shouldn't have to do it. So if I'm in the liquid fuel sector, I shouldn't do it. If I'm in the coal sector, I shouldn't have to do it. If I'm in the gas sector, I shouldn't have to do it. It should be other people who do it. So the question is, what's the sensible thing for a society like South Africa to do if confronted with this problem? My personal view is that there's a tool called cost-benefit analysis. You use that tool to weigh the costs and benefits and to reduce the emissions in those that have the least costs and the most benefits. So let me make a hypothetical example. Let's say one coal-fired power station, the emissions from that will equal to all the emissions from all the motor cars on South African roads. What would be the best thing to do? Close that power station or take all the vehicles off the roads? So that's the kind of thing that you need to weigh up in a cost-benefit analysis. So we've got just energy plans coming out of government institutions and all sorts of things, but we're not really having a sensible debate as a country about how to do this. I mean, for example, cattle farmers. Cattle release all sorts of methane, which is 10 times worse than carbon dioxide. So maybe we should stop cattle farming. I'm just making hypothetical examples to get people thinking about what the various options are. We've seen in the United States, in California, where they introduced these things, what did oil refineries do? They, instead of closing down parts of their operations, they went out and they bought old motor cars and scrapped them. So they took those emissions from old motor cars off the roads and they met their, in inverted commas, nationally determined contribution as an oil refinery, doing it that way. And I mentioned that's just an example of a bit of lateral thinking that can be done. I think that the bottom line is that we can't carry on business as usual. As a human species, we have to do something to try to perpetuate the species or allow it to live. So in the liquid fuel sector, there are all kinds of things. So let me just throw out another simple example. We import all our petroleum. Some of it we make from local coal. We don't import any electricity. We make it from local coal, wind, and solar power. So prima facie, there's an excellent case to say, let's switch South Africa to local content, to import substitution industrialization. Let's not propel our vehicles with imported petroleum at dollar-denominated prices. Let's propel them with wind, solar, and coal, with electric vehicles. That would make, on a prima facie case, eminent good sense. Not easy to do, by no means. There are all sorts of opportunities which can create jobs instead of losing jobs, which is what a lot of people are concerned about, and rightfully so. So these are just some of the things which I think, if we did a proper cost-benefit analysis, would throw up ones that cost the least and yield the most benefit. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Prof. Crompton. And before you actually switch off, I've got a follow-up question for you. Then what do you think possibly, I know that you have highlighted a bit on the role that the sector can actually play towards just energy transition. And what are the actual challenges that the sector is actually facing? Because I know you did highlight the fact that the reason why we are going towards the just energy transition is because of global warming. But then let's take the context back to South Africa. What makes your Total Energy, your Shell, to actually make the decisions that we have actually seen in media of late to actually exit more, especially the upstream side of the business?
So if we look at what the government's already done, they've introduced carbon taxes. So there's a tax on motor vehicles. The bigger the engine, the more the emissions and the greater the tax. So that's a price signal to influence motorists to buy more fuel-efficient vehicles and with smaller engines, basically. But if you go back to the oil crisis of 1973, the United States of America did an absolute revolution in improving the efficiency of their vehicles. In later years, they took their foot off the pedal and now they all drive gas guzzlers again. But that can be a huge, huge thing that can be done. Now, on the one hand, we've got government putting up the price of vehicles and imposing taxes on fuel to stop consumption, to reduce consumption. And yet, on the other hand, we see announcements in the media in the last week or so from public ministers saying, we're worried about the price of energy and petroleum in particular, we must do something about it. So on the one hand, they're putting up the price, on the other hand, they're worried about the price. But so taxation is the one instrument which is used by many, many countries. During the oil emergencies in previous years, they reduced the speed limit from 120 k's to 100 kilometers per hour. That had significant savings in fuel. Other countries have done that. So these are ways of promoting efficiency without fundamentally changing people's lifestyles. I mean, public transport, we know, is much more efficient than everybody driving their own vehicle to work. We also know that minibus taxis are highly inefficient ways of moving a dozen people from point A to point B. There are much more efficient ways of doing it. Other countries have shown us. So that's another thing that policies can do. But what we're seeing in Europe is that many countries and many cities and regions are prohibiting internal combustion engines. So what's happening globally is refineries are closing, which is reducing the price of petrol. So there's swings and roundabouts here. We could, in fact, have lower prices of petrol because of what other countries are doing. But the question is, what are we going to do if we use more petrol and diesel about our emissions? So, these are complicated issues. There are no quick, easy answers.
Thank you very much, Rod, for your contribution. And my then next question is for Dr. Saidini. Have you, with the just energy transition that we are seeing, and also the challenges that we're also observing in the industry, when it comes to then Petroleum Agency of South Africa, are you seeing or are you observing any changes when it comes to those that are applying for prospecting rights, as well as like the production component when it comes to then the oil and gas sector? Are there any changes, or everything is still as is, it's still business as usual, or are you seeing any increment when it comes to such? Over to you, Dr. Bongani.
Okay, the interest in terms of exploration in the country, I would say, remains and even is there's a bit of an increase in terms of that interest. You might have, for example, we have, in terms of exploration rights, either active exploration rights or exploration rights that are in a period that we call the white period, where a renewal has been applied for, meaning an application has been submitted to renew that a particular exploration period for the next period. We're sitting with rights beyond 30, for example, and a number of those rights being quite active in terms of exploration. There is a bit of frustration, of course, by the sector in terms of the resistance that we have seen to some of their activities. For example, we've seen a seismic acquisition being stopped around 2021 off the Wild Coast. That's the East Bizana areas or Webb St. John's areas and thereabout. A seismic acquisition was stopped there whilst already underway. Soon thereafter, there was a seismic acquisition that was also stopped off the West Coast, a seismic acquisition by Searcher. And the Shell or impact oil seismic acquisition off the Wild Coast was actually stopped through an interdict, meaning through the courts. I think the Searcher, as well. Combined, the expenditure that was stopped there, I think, runs to close to R1 billion in terms of rands. So our people stopped a significant or tangible exploration activities that could have that cost at least R1 billion rands. So that's created a bit of frustration, because it means you are not allowed to actually conduct the activities for which you were granted a license in this country. And without those activities, you would never move to a stage where you can actually drill and make discoveries of oil and gas. Another frustration, I think, to a large extent, to a large extent, is the lack of a gas market, or of it's a lack of a gas market in this country. So you have, or at least certain parts of the country, we have what one could say a thriving gas market up north, supplied by Banded Temane gas through Sasol and so on. But you have you also have a market that could be an anchor market for gas off the South Coast. For example, the Petroleum Agency gas to liquids refinery is a potential is a gas market together with, I would say, the Horikwa power plant, which is adjacent to the GTL refinery. But that market, okay, let's make an example. I would say part of the frustration that have led to Total Energies deciding that they will no longer develop that discover, the Brelbada Leiper, is to a large extent the fact that a market could not be confirmed. So meaning, whilst there is a potential market, that market could not be confirmed, and you can never take a decision to develop gas without a market or a firm gas off-taker. So that is part of a frustration in a country where you, for example, we have that GTL refinery not running since 2020 on the back of depleted gas reserves that were supplying that refinery together with associated condensate. And Total Energies had hoped that that would become part of its market. It had hoped that over time, other markets would develop on the back of that. Perhaps Korikwa could be converted. There could even perhaps be a conversation where a new refinery running on gas could be enabled. But all of those discussions are taking time, such that when you are an investor, over time you get frustrated, especially for gas. Really is challenging in that context, because you are not going to move forward without having a firm market. So the interest remains, and as a result, the interest, and especially with the developments in Namibia, with a lot of discoveries of the Orange Basin, the interest has tended to move to more oil-prone areas. So meaning the operators or right holders are now looking to invest more time, more energy in areas where they could potentially find oil, because with oil, you don't have to contend with this market that needs to be developed, because the market is readily available.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Saidini, for your contribution. It is very interesting to actually being able to say that there is still an interest when it comes to then the prospectivity then of the oil and gas industry. But then the stumbling block when it comes to then developing this industry, it's more on the market, or it's market related. So let me go to Mr. Mokel. Is there any integrated approach within the regulatory framework to actually create an enabling environment for the industry to actually embrace the energy transition? Is there any support from the government side? I know you have mentioned that the government, they have made some stance support towards then the energy trilemma, prioritizing then the energy security, followed by the affordability, then thereafter it's environmental sustainability. Can you share your observations, more especially coming from the South African Oil and Gas Alliance, as to is there any integrated approach within the regulatory framework now to create an enabling framework for the industry to advance?
Dr. Nandi, so let me answer it this way. So we have three key enablers for us to realize the benefits, assuming that the costs are adequately affordable. And those instruments, those enablers are policy, number one. And there we have within policy, in the policy bucket, we have legislation such as the NPRDA and its substitute to separate oil and gas from minerals into the Upstream Petroleum Resources Development Act. I will comment on that act in a moment, but just to complete the list of key pieces of legislation, we then also have the Gas Act, we have the Petroleum Pipelines Act, and where gas may be used in the electricity sector, it then also relates to the Electricity Regulation Act now as amended. These pieces of legislation create an enabling environment which should determine the relationship between government and not only its individual citizens, but its corporate citizens as well, those involved in the oil and gas industry. And in the upstream part that PASA regulates, where Dr. Bongani is, that upstream part is primarily the NPRDA. And now with the Upstream Petroleum Resource Development Act having been passed by Parliament, it now sits, we assume, on the President's desk, awaiting signature. I can tell you from the perspective of SAODA that the comments on the Upstream Petroleum Resources Development Bill that we had spent a lot of time preparing were completely ignored, did not feature in the final piece of legislation, and this piece of legislation has some fundamental flaws in it. The key thing is if the President signs the legislation today, but there are no regulations accompanying that legislation, or the fiscal package, including the tax regime, the royalty taxes to be collected from upstream, that would not be known. So the deal and the risks to investors in the upstream sector would be very, very difficult to make in the absence of those two pieces of work that must accompany this kind of legislation. And it's not new. It happened with the NPRDA when the NPRDA was finalized and signed into law. It did not have all of the instruments in place. And so you had this lull in call it regulatory certainty, and therefore a lull in investor confidence during that period of time. And we're going to see the same if the legislation goes ahead as is. So we're trying to find some compromise to deal with that and not, hold back the process, because there are other parts of the legislation that could perhaps go ahead, but others saying, well, let's just send it back to Parliament. Now, of what importance is that? We've heard from the Government of National Unity that it wants to have inclusive growth and that foreign direct investment is important. One would assume that domestic direct investment is also important. But at the end of the day, this inclusive growth, for it to be above 3% of GDP, as would be required to make a dent in unemployment, we will need to consider in the cost-benefit analysis, the opportunities for not only risk, but also reward. And the fiscal rewards from royalty taxes that we could gain should our regulatory framework be adequately certain. There's no such thing as absolute certainty, but adequate certainty would suffice. We could attract the investment that Namibia has, because geologically, as you could hear from Dr. Bongani, the Orange Basin on the Namibian side of the border is technically the same as the Orange Basin on the South African side of the border. What is the difference? It is regulatory certainty. Right? I would like to also concur with Dr. Mungani's assessment that before you can convert any exploration right into a production right, you need an off-taker. And you cannot find an off-taker for Rolpada and Leipat, the most likely one being on the coastline. You cannot secure your production right. And what we can see is that is perhaps the key issue there, because Total Energies is still active in the West Coast part, the Orange Basin. They have not lost confidence in South Africa as a jurisdiction to invest as yet, although it must have been disappointing to spend more than 400 million US on the preparatory work to secure the production rights, and then having effectively to throw that money away, abandoning their investment. So we need to look at these things and say, what is it that we could then do to improve the relationship between government and industry through an appropriate forum. So OGA is involved in the Busa Gas Working Group alongside the other gas industry associations, including the one that Dr. Maurice Khadebe has been with, Sapia, is part there, the IGWASA, the Industrial Gas Users Association of South Africa, they're on PASA for upstream onshore, PASA for upstream offshore, through this movement in a more collaborative manner than sending each other emails with written comments on legislation. We need to strategize together, because it's an opportunity worth pursuing, and we can do it in a responsible manner that meets all of our imperatives.
Thank you, Craig, for your input. Indeed, I think you know, the associations in the sector, it's good that they are coming together and being able, so that they are able to actually coordinate, or they should be well coordinated so that they can have more voice or a better voice towards policy inputs. But it's also said when you are actually saying some of your comments or from Sauga, they were actually not included on the Upstream Petroleum Resources Bill, which is awaiting to be signed by the president. And let's move forward to Professor Rod Crompton. Professor Crompton, looking at the 2030 and 2050 net zero targets, how do the country, or how can the country actually fast track the projects across the value chain of the petroleum industry to ensure security of supply before the window of the opportunity closes?
So, I mean, I've already partly answered that by saying the easy answer to security of supply is to go electric. Then you've got, I think there's security of supply of the sun. I think the sun is going to keep shining for a long time. And the same with wind. Coal will run out eventually, but at least it's under our feet and we can dig it up and use it if we need to. So from a security of supply point of view, electric vehicles is the ultimate answer. So long as we rely on imported petroleum, there's a risk of interruption, whether it's refined products or crude oil. Of course, as other colleagues on the panel have been pointing out, we could explore for our own oil and gas, but you know, I go back to 2002 when we had the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, and all of the oil majors walked away from South Africa because our legislation was not investor friendly. And that unfriendly environment has remained. The odd one out has been Total, which, as Craig pointed out, were either very brave or very stupid and invested that large sum of money in their exploration efforts and then walked away from it, presumably because there wasn't a sufficiently attractive dispensation. However, those who look to gas, you know, rule number one in gas, you must have all your ducks in a row. So part of the problem with gas is, do you have the customers? Do you have the offtake? And I think that is part of the problem that Total faced. You know, PetroSA was not standing up to be a reliable customer. Eskom was not standing up to be a reliable customer for gas to power. And industry, well, unfortunately, it's a very, very long way from Mossel Bay to where the industry in our economy is. Not practical to deliver it that far. But perhaps something could have been done with containerization and so on.
Thank you, Rod. Okay.
I'll leave it there.
Okay. So by then, next question to you is, how can we learn from other global communities like your US? It's highly dependent on gas. Its economy or its energy security, it's highly dependent on gas. And since all of the panel members, you have highlighted that the current stumbling block when it comes to then advancement of the sector is the fact that there is no market. So what can we learn then from USA to make sure that the country has got the market for gas, and then that will actually enable the country to actually develop our gas resources, our oil and gas resources for that matter?
I think a better example would be Australia. So off the northwest shelf of Australia, we have humanity's largest investment project in the Gorgon gas field and processing plants and exporting plants from that gas field. At the other corner, on the diagonally opposite corner of Australia in the southeast, you've got renewable energy responsible for almost all of the electricity in the same country. So this transition is not an easy, uniform step. You might be strong in oil and gas on one side and strong in renewables on the other side, but taken together, you are making progress towards those 2050 goals and so on. And the same might be true in South Africa. You know, Eskom has got that lovely map of its grid. It reimposes that grid over Western Europe. It covers almost all the countries of Western Europe. we forget how big South Africa is. You know, because we talk easily about Mossel Bay, we forget it's over 1,000 kilometers from Gauteng. You know, that's more than the distance from Paris to Moscow. You know? So we might have different parts of the country doing very, very different things, but we need to, you know, apply common sense, apply cost-benefit analysis, and be rational about what we're doing and get the conversation going. Unfortunately, the debate in this country is so fractured, and people are so deeply buried in their own little silos. They're not coming to the surface and having a proper engagement with all of the other silos and all of the other vested interests. So, you know, the president has been talking for years now about some sort of national convention or national conversation. Perhaps the energy group in South Africa, the energy stakeholders, should have a national discussion on energy in South Africa, because we aren't really talking to each other. We're talking past each other.
That's so interesting, Rod. I just want to one last question from my side. I just want to tap into the fact that you said one of the opportunities, it's your electric vehicle. It's, you know, the implementation or the execution of then the electric vehicle industry. And you must remember that I think it was last year in November, that's when the EV policy, white paper policy, was actually promulgated. Do you really think that are we very close to having that industry on a fully fledged you know, scenario? As you know, how far are we when it comes to then having that industry in the country, or allowing such an industry in the country, since we've just recently published our white paper policy on EV?
These transitions are very difficult. And we have an auto manufacturing industry which has been subsidized and protected for many, many years. Its problem is that it produces internal combustion engines for European markets. 60% of the vehicles get exported to Western Europe. The problem for them is that Western Europe is going to electric vehicles. So it's not going to be, they won't have economies of scale if they have to produce both internal combustion engines and electric vehicles in South Africa. So the automobile industry wants a signal from the government to say, look, guys, which way are we going? Are we going EVs or are we going internal combustion engines? Because we have investment plans to make. In the past, we've been discriminating against electric vehicles. So, you know, if we're going to subsidize as we do internal combustion engines, why don't we subsidize electric vehicles where we use local fuels? You know, so government is having difficulty making this transition and managing it, and it's very reluctant to let market forces determine these things. I mean, if you or I want to choose between white bread or brown bread, we just choose and we go to the supermarket and we decide. But government is deciding for us whether we want electric vehicles or internal combustion engines, because it's influencing the price through its various industrial policies and so on. So managing these legacy industrial policies like promoting the automobile industry is part of the difficulty. And we need really astute people in government to manage this transition, both in the auto industry, but also in the liquid fuels industry and in the wider energy industry. And that's not apparent and you can see that from the remarks of my colleagues on this panel, complaining about various legislation, not dealing with this and that, and not being offensive. So I circle back to my closing point again. Let's have a proper national conversation where we actually talk to each other and not past each other.
And also, let me add on to that and allow, with what you have said, and allow then the market force to actually determine the direction of JET. Thank you, thank you. I would like, that's the end of my questions. I would like us to actually go to Q&A. I can see that we have some few questions on the Q&A box. So the first question it's from Aldrin Govindasamay. I hope that I'm pronouncing your surname well, and my apologies if I'm not. So the question is, so the big question, how was this uneconomical, when the benefits were so good for the total exploration? I think I will actually pose this question to Dr. Saidini, and possibly he can be assisted by Prof. Crompton. You're on mute, Dr. Saidini.
Okay, I guess that relates to Total Energy's exit from Block 11B, 12B. What makes, I guess, a gas project works? I think we've elaborated at length that a market is key. Otherwise, gas can be stranded, for example. And I think it's important, for example, I think the Pandey gas, which was ultimately developed and has been supplying Sasol and others through the construction of an import pipeline, could have been stranded gas had it not been enabled somehow, right? Anyway, maybe let's move away from that. But what makes any project commercially viable is that that project or that product must have a market. So if you don't have a market, if you cannot find a market, that alone makes your project commercially unviable because you have no one to offtake your product or your gas in this case. So it's as simple as that. Is the case might have been commercial, not might have been, is commercially unviable because there is no firm offtake of the gas. Yes, there are other considerations, but things like harsh mid-ocean conditions, making it difficult to develop in that area. For example, the current, the Agulhas current, I think it's the second harshest in the world. But Total have demonstrated to have the resilience and the capabilities to drill in those waters successfully. So they drilled 2 successful wells. They were prepared to really go in there. I think for me, the key issue is what made this business case fall flat is there not being an offtake. You might have, you have these other considerations, but that kills a business case because no one will develop anything that has no one to buy.
Then I do understand the concern, but a follow-up question then from me now, not from the Q&A, would be then, how did then Total decide, well, what was the decision to actually drill on those 2 wells? What was it made out of if then they have seen that they don't have a market in 2024? But I think that's another discussion, possibly, Dr. Saidini, that we can take out of this platform. Our then next question is from Kanyisile Masemula. The question is, I have a question to the panel. Since the argument is that the petroleum sector has been overlooked compared to the electricity sector, does that mean as SA it would be better to use less coal and rather focus on petroleum and oil? I think then that's for electricity generation. Prof. Crompton or Mr. Mokel, do you want to respond to such a question?
I think I've answered it. My answer is cost-benefit analysis. Don't just pick randomly, base it on evidence.
So it must be done on evidence that it can actually work.
I mean, the questioner is asking us to choose between 2. And I'm saying if you want to choose, get the facts and evidence, do a cost-benefit analysis and make a decision based on facts and evidence, not just sucking your thumb.
Okay. Mr. Mokel, you wanted to also respond to support Prof. Crompton, or maybe you have a different view from actually what he's saying?
No, fully agree with Prof. Crompton. that cost benefit analysis can be done in various ways. And I alluded to that earlier by saying that when they do the energy modeling, it's a techno-economic exercise, right? It does not include the socioeconomic impacts. And what Rod is saying is that a cost benefit analysis will take into account not only the techno-economic costs and benefits, but also could include other considerations, such as the impact on unemployment, poverty, and inequality, right? And that can be measured in various ways. I mean, we're also signatories to the Sustainable Development Goals. One can measure this through, Human Development Index and other units of measure to measure quality of life, really. But to come back to the original question, policy, planning, and procurement work together as enablers, right? And so the policy and policy certainty needs to be there. The planning needs to be clear, needs to be evidence-based. It must talk to the input assumptions and scenarios that we sketch in that energy mix, and each of those scenarios then has a socioeconomic impact. If we can do that in an appropriate forum where we provide the evidence, I think we would move on from unnecessary debates and actually start collaborating and implementing the strategy as an integrated unit. And from a systems operator perspective, I think that's all that they want. They want a system that works 24/7, meets demand, does so at an affordable price, and doesn't do any more harm to the environment than is absolutely necessary. And if we are saying that at some stage we will achieve 100% variable renewable energy, that's fine. But in the interim, the phase down from dirtier options to cleaner options, higher emissions to lower emissions, that can start now, especially in that 70% of final energy consumption that is non-electrical energy. Right? I think it's closer now to 68%, but electricity is only 30 to 32% of final energy consumption. And yet we assume that by going 100% renewable energy, we would be able to electrify everything. 70% of our economy that's not electrified as yet. So it's a big task, and the ambition is necessary, but the constraints are there, and that then determines the realities. So the formula is ambition minus constraints equals realities. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mr. Buckel. So our next then question is from an anonymous attendee. The question goes on, is SA government investing in the R&D on this global topic of jet to determine if this is feasible for the country to align with the global targets within a given period? Emission reduction is called to 50% in 2030 and net zero in 2050. I guess the question is, does the country do R&D work when it comes to this? I'm not sure any of my panel members, if you want to respond to this, can you? I'm not going to select anyone to respond. Yes, Prof. Compton?
So, I mean, the evidence we can see is that the president has established the Presidential Climate Commission. So there are people employed there, they are doing research, money is being spent on this climate problem that the country and the world have got. The Department of Science and Technology, or whatever it's called now, that's got a new name, they have a budget which they spend on R&D, and they've been spending money on hydrogen for years. Some of us will say, well, that's, not really a good bet because hydrogen is very expensive. But anyway, they are spending money, whether it's wisely or unwisely, they are spending money. So is it enough? Well, if you look at advanced economies, it's the private sector that does a lot of R&D. But if you look at South African companies, their spending on R&D is way below the international norm. So it's not only government that should spend, it's also the private sector. And in this country, both the government doesn't have a lot of money to spend because the government is almost, it has huge debt, doesn't have a lot of money to spare. And the private sector is not really spending on R&D. So that's where we are.
Thank you, Rod, for your response. Our next question then is from also an anonymous attendee. By saying Total Energies disinvested from their offshore exploration as a result of uncertainties of the market exposure, or of the market, exposed the gap in R&D as billions of rands were invested. What is the country learning from Total Energies moving to Namibia from SA? Mr. Mokel, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, look, I wasn't in the room personally when Total Energies may have spoken to a potential off-taker, but one can assume that they were discussing an off-take, because without an off-take agreement, you cannot move from an exploration right to a production right. As simple as that, right? They haven't left South Africa. They are still involved in the West Coast, Orange Basin, besides being involved in Namibia, in that part of the Orange Basin. So the issue then is regulatory certainty an issue to Total? Well, in as far as securing an off-taker is related to the regulatory framework, yes. What do I mean by that? The regulatory framework establishes a particular structure called PetroSA that operates the GTL refinery. PetroSA is a subsidiary of the Central Energy Fund. Right? The Central Energy Fund, as far as we know, reports to the Department of Mineral and Petroleum Resources under Minister Gwede Mantashe. Right? But there are parts of the value chain that are downstream, that do not fall in the upstream part, into DMPR. They're actually gas to power, as an example, falls into the jurisdiction, as we understand it at present, of the Department of Energy and Electricity. So when you talk about demand represented by, let's say, gas to power, in the downstream part of the value chain, the Department of Energy and Electricity and the Department of Mineral and Petroleum Resources and their respective portfolio organizations and regulators for upstream and downstream need to choreograph the next steps of this dance called oil and gas development, right? And that dance is in part choreographed by the Gas Master Plan, which is in draft form. We've commented on it as industry, and we hope that it will now inform an update of the Gas Master Plan in due course. We also then hope that our inputs would then inform the Integrated Resource Plan for electricity, which is still being updated. And then, of course, this must result in procurement. And the procurement is not only of gas to power in the electricity sector, but if one looks at procurement in the context that the Industrial Gas Users Association and its members using methane-rich gas will no longer be supplied by Eskom post-December 2027, right? There are more than 70,000 jobs at risk if methane-rich gas is not substituted by some or other alternative, right? And those are industries that are hard to electrify. So we need to consider that as a crisis, but we also need to consider the crises being faced by others in this scenario where it's a frog that's boiling in the water but doesn't know it, cannot feel it because it's happening so slowly. And an example of it is that there are, in the packaging and plastics industry, monomers and polymers are sourced ultimately from Sasol. Those monomers have a particular carbon content. The auto manufacturers are saying to the suppliers, we need a product from you, a plastic from you with a lower carbon content. Where will those plastic manufacturers source those lower carbon content monomers and polymers to then meet their clients' ESG commitments and their own carbon targets, greenhouse gas emission targets. So when we talk about a just energy transition, it comes with certain carrots and sticks, right? Certain punitive measures and certain incentives. And the carbon taxes that Rod referred to earlier is not only in South Africa, but there is a carbon tax on exports from South Africa into Europe, and that's referred to as a carbon border adjustment mechanism that values carbon at a particular price per gram or kilogram. And the adjustment then comes in the difference between the carbon taxes paid here and the carbon taxes required there. If I could just oversimplify things. But at the same time, and this is the big challenge, we also have to deal with this hypocrisy that our just energy transition is being financed on the basis that it's simply a technology choice and not to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by whichever means we choose. It is only supportive of renewable energy technologies, and that is wrong, in particular because Europe has a definition of sustainable energy in its taxonomy, which allows for the use of gas to power within certain parameters, emissions parameters in particular. And so if it's good for that goose, we ask why it's not good for this gander in the global south. And that the just energy transition support that they give us allow us to differentiate ourselves in this. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. Mr. Mokal, we're only left with 2 minutes. And we won't be able, I can see that there are questions on the chat box, and also there were questions also on the Q&A. So my apologies, we won't be able to actually, our panel members will not be able to respond to all the questions that were asked. But I would like, on that note, I would like to actually thank you for attending this session. And I would like to thank the Upstream Training Trust, PASA, which is the Petroleum Agency of South Africa, as well as the South African Oil and Gas Alliance, as well as then the WBS for hosting this event. And I'm hoping, and I am promising you that this is not the first and the last webinar that we are going to have, or that the WBS will be hosting. There'll be ongoing engagement so that we can also keep the momentum across the industry as to what are the challenges, and try possibly in those, also in the follow-ups webinars, possibly we'll try to actually respond to some of the questions that were asked. And on that note, I would like to thank you all for attending, and thank you.